I was checking the feed schedules near the big cat enclosures when I heard screaming, not the excited shrieks of kids seeing animals for the first time, but real terror. I dropped my clipboard and ran toward the sound, and what I saw made my blood run cold. A full-grown male lion was loose on the main pathway, walking calmly between panicked visitors. Chaos erupted instantly. A mother scooped up her toddler and dove behind a trash can. A group of teenagers scattered in every direction. An elderly man froze mid-step like he'd turned to stone. One father shoved his whole family into the gift shop and slammed the door. The lion, we called him Titan, wasn't attacking anyone, but a 400-pound predator wandering freely among civilians was a disaster waiting to happen. I grabbed my radio and started barking orders. We needed immediate evacuation protocols and the tranquilizer team. Now, I sprinted to Titan's habitat to figure out how this happened. The reinforced gate stood wide open, the electronic lock mechanism dangling uselessly from broken hinges. Then I remembered about 20 minutes earlier, the fire alarm had malfunctioned due to some electrical issue in the maintenance building. Everyone rushed to check it out, and the power surge must have fried the lock system. Titan probably just nudged the door with his paw, and it swung open, giving him freedom he'd never asked for. Titan pushed through the service gates, and I burst onto the street seconds later, just in time to see his massive form disappear around a corner. The neighborhood descended into absolute mayhem. Cars screeched to a halt, drivers scrambling back inside and locking doors. A woman walking her dog screamed and ran in the opposite direction, nearly tripping over the leash. A couple of kids on bikes stood frozen on the sidewalk, mouths hanging open. But Titan wasn't acting like an escaped predator. He was moving with purpose, stopping every few yards to sniff the air, looking around like he was searching for something specific. I followed at what I hoped was a safe distance, phone pressed to my ear as I shouted coordinates to dispatch, so they could direct the tranquilizer team to our location. Titan turned into Patterson Park, a small green space just a few blocks from the zoo. That's when I saw her. An elderly woman sitting on a bench under an old oak tree, tossing breadcrumbs to pigeons from a paper bag. The lion slowed his pace and began approaching her, his huge paws nearly silent on the grass. I screamed a warning at the top of my lungs, telling her not to move, not to run, but she couldn't hear me over the noise of people fleeing the park. Several joggers bolted for the exits. One guy pulled out his phone and started filming from behind a tree. The old woman turned at the commotion, saw a massive lion just yards away, and I braced for the worst. But instead of screaming, she just looked into his eyes and said very softly, almost in a whisper, "Titan? Is that really you?" What happened next? I'll remember for the rest of my life. That enormous lion slowly sank to the ground in front of her, laid his massive head in her lap, and made a low rumbling sound that was more like a giant cat purring than anything else. The woman reached out with a trembling hand and started stroking his mane, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. Within minutes, zoo security vehicles and police cars arrived with sirens blaring. Armed guards jumped out carrying tranquilizer rifles. I rushed over, waving my arms and yelling for them to hold their fire. The head of security looked at me like I'd lost my mind, then looked at the scene on the bench, an elderly woman embracing a full-grown lion, and slowly lowered his weapon. I quickly explained that this woman clearly knew this lion, that there was some kind of connection between them. He ordered everyone to keep weapons ready but not to shoot. I carefully approached the bench and asked the woman if she could explain what was happening. Titan didn't even turn his head toward me, just lay there with his muzzle on her lap, his amber eyes half closed. I sat down on the far edge of the bench, trying not to spook the massive predator, and as calmly as possible asked how she knew this lion. The woman wiped her tears and began telling a story that gave me chills. 12 years ago, she worked as a volunteer at a wildlife rehabilitation center. One day, rangers brought in a tiny lion cub they'd found next to his dead mother's body. Poachers had killed her for a trophy and left the baby to die. The cub was maybe a month old with a broken front leg and a severe infection spreading through his small body. Every veterinarian said his chances were basically zero. But this woman, her name was Eleanor, decided to try to save him anyway. As she talked, I could picture it. A small golden ball of fur with huge frightened eyes, a bloody little paw being carefully cleaned and bandaged. Eleanor nursed that cub for 3 months. She bottle-fed him every 2 hours, even through the night, administered antibiotic injections, massaged his injured leg. The cub gradually grew stronger. After a month, he could stand on 3 legs. Another month, he took his first steps. By the end of the 3rd month, he'd become a playful youngster who followed Eleanor everywhere. When the cub got bigger, the vets took follow-up x-rays. The leg had healed, but incorrectly, the bone had set with a slight curve, and Titan developed a limp, especially after running or playing for extended periods. All the specialists agreed on one thing: releasing him into the wild was impossible. With that injury, he simply wouldn't survive. He couldn't hunt alongside a pride, couldn't escape danger. The only solution was finding a good zoo where Titan would have a decent life, proper nutrition, and veterinary care. Eleanor personally contacted several zoos, researched their conditions, studied inspector reports, and chose ours because we had an excellent reputation and spacious enclosures for big cats. She brought teenage Titan herself, spent a whole day in his new habitat, helping him adjust, and then left. It was one of the hardest days of her life. I asked why she hadn't visited him all these years. Eleanor explained that a week after bringing Titan to the zoo, she was urgently deployed to Africa. A mass die-off of elephants was happening due to drought and poaching. They needed experienced specialists. She spent nearly 10 years in Africa, saving elephants, rhinos, giraffes, lions, cheetahs. More than that, she assumed Titan had died long ago. The average lifespan of lions in captivity is 10 to 14 years. A few months ago, Eleanor finally returned home to retire. Exhausted and aged but happy that she'd helped hundreds of animals over those years. Yesterday, her granddaughter from out of state visited and convinced her to go to the zoo, just to walk around and see the animals. They strolled down the pathways, looking at zebras, giraffes, bears, and suddenly Eleanor saw the lion enclosure. The sign read, "Titan Male African Lion, age 12. She froze in disbelief, stepped closer to the barrier. The lion was lying in the shade of a large rock, and when Eleanor softly spoke his name, he lifted his head and looked directly at her. She saw the scar on his front leg, that exact mark from the improperly healed bone she remembered, and knew it was him. Eleanor wanted to approach zoo staff, tell them who she was, ask permission to at least stand by his enclosure longer, but suddenly got scared. So many years had passed, she had no documentation proving her connection to Titan. What if they didn't believe her? What if they thought she was some crazy old woman making up stories? She left confused, said goodbye to her granddaughter, and went home. But she couldn't sleep all night, remembering how Titan had looked at her. This morning, when the fire alarm malfunctioned and the lock on the enclosure broke, Titan simply pushed the door and walked out. He didn't want to escape, didn't want to hurt people, he just wanted to find that woman whose scent, whose voice he'd recognized yesterday after 12 years of separation. Lions have phenomenal memory and the ability to remember scents for many years, and Titan remembered the scent of the one who saved his life when he was a helpless, dying cub. I sat listening to this incredible story, unable to hold back my emotions. A crowd had gathered around us. Police officers, zoo security, veterinarians with tranquilizer guns, random passers-by filming everything on their phones. Titan still lay with his head in Eleanor's lap, and she stroked him like he wasn't a dangerous predator but a large house cat. I knew we had to resolve this somehow. The lion needed to return to the zoo because keeping a predator on the street was simply impossible. But I also understood that if we tried to separate them by force, Titan might attack, either defending Eleanor or just from stress. I called the zoo director and explained the entire story in detail. He was skeptical at first, started talking about safety protocols, but I insisted. After long negotiations, he agreed to a compromise. Eleanor would receive a permanent VIP pass allowing her to visit the zoo anytime and spend as much time at Titan's enclosure as she wanted. They'd install a special chair for her next to the barrier. When I told Eleanor this news, she broke down crying with happiness. She leaned down to Titan, pressed her forehead to his head, and whispered something to him. He closed his eyes and purred softly. Then she stood up, and Titan obediently walked beside her back to the zoo. The whole procession looked surreal. An elderly woman in a summer dress, a massive lion beside her, surrounded by a crowd with weapons and cameras. Eleanor came to the zoo the next morning as soon as it opened. She brought an old photo album with pictures from tiny cub Titan's life. Here he is, sleeping curled up in a blanket. Here trying to catch a toy. Here taking his first steps on 3 legs. Here sitting in Eleanor's arms, looking at the camera with huge baby eyes. She showed me these photos, and I could barely believe that small helpless bundle had become the magnificent animal now lying in his enclosure watching us. Eleanor sat in the chair, prepared for her by the barrier, and Titan immediately came to the glass, lay down on the other side to be as close to her as possible, and they just sat like that, looking at each other. From that day on, Eleanor came every day, sometimes morning, sometimes afternoon, spending 2 to 3 hours by the enclosure. She'd bring a book and read aloud, tell Titan about her life, what she'd seen and done during those years in Africa, about the animals she'd saved. Titan always came to her, lay by the glass and listened, his amber eyes carefully following the movement of her lips, and sometimes he purred softly in response to her words. Zoo visitors quickly learned about this amazing story, and many came specifically to watch Eleanor and Titan's meetings. Some filmed videos that got millions of views on social media. Journalists requested interviews, but Eleanor politely declined publicity. She said it was their private time with Titan, and she didn't need fame or attention. I often stopped by the enclosure myself, observing them. I was amazed at how Titan reacted to Eleanor. Normally he was calm but fairly indifferent to all visitors, could lie in the shade all day ignoring crowds at the barrier. But the moment Eleanor appeared, he literally came alive, stood up, stretched and walked to the glass, taking his favorite spot opposite her chair. Sometimes, when the zoo closed and visitors left, I let Eleanor stay an extra half hour, and in those quiet moments their bond was especially visible. Titan would place his huge paw on the glass, and Eleanor would press her palm from the other side, and they'd sit like that, motionless, as if time had stopped. Several months passed, and I noticed Eleanor was losing weight, her face becoming gaunt, her movements slower and more careful. I asked if everything was okay, if she needed help, but she just smiled and said old age was catching up, nothing special. Nevertheless, she continued coming every day, even when weather turned bad and rains began. I'd see her sitting under an umbrella in her chair while Titan lay under a shelter in the enclosure, but always at the spot where he could see Eleanor. One morning, doing my usual rounds before the zoo opened, I stopped at Titan's enclosure and noticed the lion behaving strangely. He sat by the glass, in that exact spot where he usually lay during Eleanor's visits, staring at the empty chair. From time to time he made a low growl, more like a mournful howl, and I felt my heart tighten. Eleanor didn't come that day. Didn't come the next day either. By the third day I knew something was definitely wrong, and decided to drive to her house, the address she'd left at the zoo office for emergency contact. When I arrived at her house, a neighbor, an elderly man watering flowers in his yard, saw me and came over. He told me Eleanor had died 3 days ago, at night in her sleep. Her granddaughter found her the next morning after getting worried when Grandma didn't answer calls. Doctors said her death was peaceful, her heart simply stopped from old age, without pain or suffering. I stood listening to these words, feeling tears welling up. I'd only known Eleanor a few months, but I'd come to have tremendous respect for this amazing woman who dedicated her entire life to saving animals and who found the strength to love and care even after years of separation. I returned to the zoo with a heavy heart and went to Titan's enclosure. The lion still sat by the glass, staring at the empty chair. And when I came closer, he turned his head and looked at me. In his amber eyes was something that made me stop, as if he understood Eleanor would never come again, as if he felt this loss as acutely as any human would. I sat in her chair, and Titan continued watching me, then slowly lay down, put his head on his paws, and closed his eyes. He didn't make a sound, but his chest heaved heavily, and I knew he was grieving. A week later, a lawyer representing Eleanor's family came to the zoo. He brought documents showing Eleanor had made a will several months earlier. Shortly after reuniting with Titan, she'd left instructions to sell her small house and give the proceeds to the zoo with one condition. These funds must be used exclusively to improve living conditions for Titan and other big cats. The zoo director was amazed by her generosity and promised every cent would be used as intended. I took personal responsibility for Titan. Every morning I came to his enclosure first thing, brought him the best cuts of meat, made sure he always had fresh water and clean bedding. I talked to him, told him about Eleanor, how she loved him, how proud she'd be of what a beautiful and strong lion he'd become. Titan was noticeably depressed the first weeks, moved less, ate less, but gradually began returning to normal life. He still came every day to that spot by the glass where Eleanor used to sit, lay there for a while, as if keeping her memory alive. With money from Eleanor's will, we significantly improved Titan's enclosure, added high platforms for surveying surroundings, more shelters from sun and weather, installed automatic cooling for hot days, added new environmental enrichment elements, logs, rocks for claw sharpening, different levels for climbing. For the zoo's other big cats, we also made improvements, expanded space, updated equipment, installed modern veterinary facilities. In the center of Titan's enclosure, we placed a small memorial plaque with Eleanor's name and a short inscription, in memory of a woman who saved lives and gave love without boundaries. Another year has passed. Titan continues living in his spacious enclosure, and I still come to him every morning. He's become a real zoo celebrity. People travel from far away to see the lion with an incredible story that's been written about in dozens of articles and featured in several documentaries. But for me, Titan isn't just an attraction. He's a living reminder that bonds between living beings can be stronger than any circumstances, stronger than time, and even stronger than instincts. Eleanor and Titan prove that love and memory have no species boundaries, that gratitude and devotion can live in the heart of even the wildest predator if someone once showed them real care and kindness.